Do you remember the occasion when you first felt consciousness of your own individual self?
That was in my 11th year. There I suddenly, on my way to school, I stepped out of a mist. It was just as if I had been in a mist, walking in a mist, and I stepped out of it and I knew I am. I am what I am. And then I thought, but what have I been before? And then I found that I had been in a mist.
The point of life, the place where it's at, is simply here and now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about and other things.
All right, we are joined with Spagericist, Alchemist, Hermeticist, and Alchemicultural Practitioner, Phoenix Aurelius. Glad to have you back. This should be a fun one today. We're able to have Ashley on here as well. So how's it going?
Awesome. Good. Thanks so much for having me, you guys.
Yeah, good to have you.
So we were just talking recently about how you and Nori don't use cell phones, and I thought that was pretty badass, and it got me thinking. I consider you like a very present and aware person, and I talk often about the importance of being present, although I don't practice what I preach as often as I would like. But sure. I'm always observing others and trying to recognize patterns that might contribute to one's character and just overall well-being. And maybe that has something to do with that. But another thing I noticed that you use like a standing desk that you work from. So just like developing habits like using a cell phone or biohacks like arranging the way you work to improve posture or whatever. I think that kind of stuff adds up and really makes a difference. So I kind of wanted to ask you about some of your personal daily practices that you attribute to maintaining a healthy mind, or just some daily things that you've incorporated or changed in your life over time that you would say have really benefited you and your well-being that may be helpful for others.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, Nori and I mean, in technicality, like I do have a smartphone, but it's a very old one, and I don't actually have any apps available on it, and I don't use it, and it stays in airplane mode. Same with Nori. She has one hers is also really old, but she has it just for emergencies, just like I do. And it's not something that we use. Like oftentimes it'll be like a camera function or something like that if we do use it. But that has been enormous, because every time, it's actually unfair to you as the individual to have your day interrupted at any time that other people feel that they want to get a hold of you. It's very, very rude and disrupts your lifestyle, because now you spend what you could be doing in focusing or whatever else, being able to be at the beck and call of other individuals. And if you want to try and cultivate your own independence and like your own sense of like, hey, I'm doing this, then you create times where you will be available. So like, for instance, you can let people know, hey, go ahead and text me and I'll respond between the hours of 3 and 4, or, create some sort of discipline for yourself so that you can do those things. And if there's some sort of an emergency, you're free to like look at your phone whenever you want, if that's what you want to do. But, keeping it on airplane mode just completely shuts off all of the abilities for things to come through, and also cuts down on the amount of radiation that you have. So that's been one of the things that I and Nori have found to be extremely valuable, and to give us our time back to be able to do whatever it is that we feel is necessary for us, whether it's focusing on working or focusing on studying or performing ritual or whatever it is. Like, we're fully enmeshed in that thing, and we don't allow people to interrupt whatever it is. That, as simple of a concept as that is, like, you couldn't do this before like 1970s anyway. You know what I mean? Like, people would try and give you a call, and if you weren't home, you wouldn't get, you would just come home and check your messages and give them a call back. Like, very few things are urgent enough that it actually demands you to have your attention put on it immediately. So I think that's something that's been a huge thing for me. And then, like you mentioned, like working at a standing desk, or actually right now I'm at a sitting station, but I've got an ergonomic chair and a full ergonomic station here. Yeah, it's just like little things like that help to not only maintain physical well-being, but it also ends up not taking a toll on your mind, because when you're focusing on pain or discomfort or other things, it detracts from what you're actually doing. So and you know, realistically, listening to that pain is important too, because if you're in a situation where you are at the computer for many hours a day and it's not comfortable for you, or it's causing some sort of aggravation to your physical body, then you need to discontinue doing it. That's what your body's trying to tell you. It's like speaking very loudly, saying that. So yeah, just like little things like that, being attuned to the way that the body and the mind are speaking to you, and not letting your mind wander throughout the day due to little distractions. You know, if you're going to hop on Facebook, create structured times that you're going to get on there. Unless you're waiting for somebody's response or something like that. You know, if you do use a cell phone, take Messenger completely off of your phone. Don't allow yourself to send or receive messages from FB Messenger or other programs, because then you end up wasting your entire day, and you get little dopamine rushes, so it becomes very addictive, but it doesn't do absolutely anything good for you in the long term. It actually denigrates the body, denigrates the mind, and just overall pushes a state of lack of wellness. So
Yeah, definitely. You know, and with this whole like virus dealio going around, I don't know what to think, but I'm just trying to kind of go above and beyond from my diet to my posture and daily habits. And I was actually poking through like a book recently on human magnetism and mental magnetism, and it brought up stimulants like coffee as kind of damaging, like for, you know, the nervous system. And I definitely have a tendency to overdo the stimulants. I've been drinking like Bang and pre-workout like every day for I don't even know how long. But I think I'm almost 2 weeks and a half or so no caffeine. But anyway, yeah, I think it's all about balance ultimately.
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I said, how do you feel from doing that?
A lot more calm, I guess. Yeah.
Not going to bench press the couch at any minute.
Right. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, like, and like magnetism, or like the vital force, and kind of keeping it balanced. Also your thoughts on some alternative, like more favorable stimulants for maintaining high energy, like physically and mentally throughout the day, that's more gentle on the central nervous system. Sure.
So yeah, in terms of keeping vitality high, vitality is one of those things that I check and I break down into multiple different levels. Like, and I try and keep all of those levels balanced for myself as well as for my IDF clients and wellness clients and stuff. Is like, I look at it as spiritual vitality, which is to say your amount of discipline every day and your amount of resolve. When you think a thought of something you want to do you give yourself permission to and stick with the resolve to actually do that thing? Because if not, then you're not developing discipline, and your spiritual life is just going to crumble, or it's going to be very atrophied. So that's the first thing. Causal vitality, which is basically like when you start a project, do you have clear definitions for what it looks like from starting it and ending it? Are there really clear like understandings of what you're engaging in, whether that's a thought and where a thought begins, or whether that's the emotion and where the emotion begins and ends? Or, you know, how much energy you're going to give something anytime that you begin a task. That's all part of our causal vitality. There's more to it than that too, but that's pretty succinct. Then we have our astral vitality, which is to say how much energy are we allowing to flow through us, and how aware of that energy are we of the planets, as well as the thoughts and emotions that are moving through our space. So for instance, whereas the causal plane begins with the amount of time or duration or like cutoff points, like origin point, cutoff point, the astral vitality itself is how much emphasis or how much awareness is being placed on that thing as you're thinking it or as you're feeling it. Because if you're so distracted that you can't really feel things properly, then you're not really listening to the impulses on an emotional level or on a mental level. And those are going to decrease that astral vitality. And then, of course, there's the physical vitality. And this is where most people overemphasize things in the modern age, because they put so much emphasis on like keep my body really healthy and do all these things, but they don't. They just think about it in terms of gym and like counting calories or like, you know, wildly mediocre concepts like this, instead of thinking about, you know, like, is my body talking to me? Like, if you have to go urinate, are you waiting for 45 minutes in order to go do that? Or are you actually listening to the impulse of the body as it's there and as it's present? So in terms of vitality, all of these things all together create what is referred to as general vitality. And if your general vitality isn't high, then you're going to feel pretty schmuckish, actually. And you know, in IDF data, the way that we take this is on a scale between 0 to, you know, it could go to 1 million, but typically we limit that at 10,000. I've never seen myself get over about 1,100 to 1,200. I've never seen anybody else come even remotely close to that, although I've heard of other individuals, but you usually don't ever get above, you know, about 1,500 at best. Most people's wellness, when they first come to me, sits around about the 300 range, sometimes lower, sometimes maybe just a little bit higher, 350, 360, but it usually isn't much higher than that. And that's because they're living very incoherent lifestyles, spiritually, causally, astrally, and physically. I also include etheric vitality too, which deals with, in Western terminology, we would say that that's the fascial network and how well the fascial network is actually able to send chi, or life force energy, through the body and keep everything connecting and working really well, because fascia is like a net, a web that sends fluid crystalline signals throughout the entire body. So I look at all of those things, and if the overall wellness is really poor in terms of their vitality, then that's the first thing that we really need to tonify, and to get that at least to the minimum range of basic wellness for the human individual, which sits between 400 to 600. 400 to 600 is pretty average, like in terms of the capacity of an individual, if they were doing proper things like daily rituals in the morning and the evening, structuring their day in such a way that they don't have any stress, or if they do have a job that's really stressful, being able to balance out, say, every conference call or every meeting with 5 minutes on like a chi machine that shakes you back and forth just in such a way that it's able to produce a release of various neurotransmitters and chemicals to help balance out that kind of stress and things like that. You know, different types of practices like this in order to get to about 400 to 600. Ideally, I like all my clients to be in the 700 to 1,000 range, and to have all of their levels balanced. Spiritual, you know, being about 1,000, have their causal being about 1,000, so on and so forth. That's like the ideal that I'm kind of trying to get everybody to. At least the types of clients that I'm working with, because then when you have that, you're very fortified. And it's not that you're impervious to diseases or impervious to things that could affect your wellness negatively, but you tend to be much more resilient, far more resilient to those things. So yeah, in terms of vitality, like that's kind of what I look at. In terms of like stimulants that you can use, realistically, we try to avoid the use of stimulants altogether in any form of responsible herbalism unless they're absolutely necessary. The reason is that stimulant use almost always creates dependence. And so it's much better to utilize what we would refer to as adaptogenic herbs. And some of those could be referred to possibly, or have secondary characteristics as being considered as a stimulant, like for instance, American ginseng. But you know, Chinese ginseng is way too hot for most people, and most American diets and most American lifestyles already have an abundance of fire, partially because of the constitution of the general European and also African American types of diet and way of life. It's already so high in fire, same with Latino American, so on and so forth. It's already very high in its fire rate. So taking things, especially like Korean red ginseng, that's very, very hot and fiery, can actually cause heart attacks and more stress than what it is actually going to take away. So using American ginseng, which is cooling to the body, is really awesome. That begins to be adaptogenic. And then things like, you know, rhodiola, rhamania, astragalus, eleuthero root, Siberian ginseng, things like that are typically much better to be used on a daily basis, and they're safe to be used on a daily basis if taken in consideration with one's constitution and whatever other types of conditions or disease that they find themselves with at any given point. And any good herbalist, either in the Western tradition, Ayurvedic tradition, Siddhi medicine tradition, Chinese medicine tradition, or any other form of Oriental medicine tradition, should be able to provide some form of diagnosis of all of those things, what the constitution is, what the current energetics are, and what types of herbs would actually be best to cultivate energy in the long term and to be able to sustain it. But I find that usually the practices of mentalism are really critically important. For instance, if you can visualize things very strongly, and if you can't, then you just start off where you're at and try and visualize, for 20 seconds at a time, try and visualize something that you've actually seen. I like to use rose tools for that very same thing. That's very common within the Berkeley Psychic Institute and other different people who have been through Louis Bostwick's courses or other Berkeley Psychic Institute courses. We use a lot of rose visualizations because almost everybody has actually seen a rose and has a clear visualization of what that looks like. So you close your eyes, get into the center of your head, visualize what that rose looks like, spin it around, try and look at it from different angles, different types of things like that. And you just start really small. At first, it's going to be hard for you to do anything but maybe an outline of the rose. Over time, it'll be, the full-on rose. You'll be able to, in your mind, actually take your hand and rub the stem and feel the waxiness of the botanical stem of the rose and be able to smell the rose without a rose even being present in your space, and so on and so forth. But the more that you develop those powers of mentalism, the more that you're able to develop visuals of other things inside of the body, like, for instance, the adrenal glands or the brain or the entire neurological system or multiple different systems of the body, and being able to see those being tonified, see them like the internal Taoist practice of seeing them smiling, each of the organs smiling back at you. It creates a strong tonification. When all the organ systems are balanced, especially within the context of Oriental medicine, then your energy levels typically stay high. So.
Oh, yeah, and while we're on that subject, you spent some time in South America at one point, I believe, and you experienced the coca leaf.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of a good example of how it's an error to just blanket demonize a plant based on someone's misuse of it, because it can be beneficial within the context. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, within Peru, nobody is addicted to coca. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, but it's very difficult to be addicted to coca itself. And it is also somewhat unpleasant if you exceed a certain threshold or a dosage. Not that the coca leaf ever provides anything even remotely close to cocaine. So I'm not talking about that level of like overdose or anything like that. It's that it just becomes unpleasant because you lose all of your appetite and you just are able to work around the clock. If you drink it as a tea, which is very common, they call that mate de coca. If you drink it as a tea, super awesome, but it also flushes out the bowels. So if you drink too much of that tea every day, then it becomes, like I said, again, an unpleasant experience. But they have it dialed in a cultural way in Bolivia and Peru and Ecuador, where you have small amounts of it. You typically even for breakfast, so that you can skip the first meal, especially if you're hiking or in the highlands and so on and so forth. And it just kind of suppresses the appetite and gives you enough energy and nourishment to continue going all day long. So yeah, I found that to be a very, very cool and powerful ally. And during the time that I was in Peru, I was drinking mate de coca and chewing fresh coca leaves, dried coca leaves, like all sorts of things all day long. Unfortunately, during the time that I was there, I didn't ever do the traditional way, which is like a coca leaf and powder with a little bit of lime, powdered lime. Never got to do it that way, but that's the way that is most traditional and works the fastest also in instances where people have like altitude sickness or looking to suppress hunger, things like that.
So interesting.
It's cool too, actually. They have la hoja de coca no es una droga. They say that like all the time. La hoja de coca no es una droga. It means the coca leaf is not a drug, and you'll find like little stickers all over in the airports in Bolivia and Peru and stuff like this, where it specifically will like say that, like notebooks, stickers, like all this stuff, almost like a propaganda, because it's been so demonized in the West. But really it was the West that turned it into a drug by extracting and potentizing the alkaloids. So here we think like, oh man, it's such a drug, like, but coca leaf has virtually no capacity to even be used irresponsibly, and it isn't used irresponsibly by the native populations there. So yeah.
Now, yeah, I want you to get into the multidimensional nature of things a little, and explore the layers of our multidimensional anatomy and see how Kabbalah may come into play at all in relation to our native organs of perception or chakras or human energy fields, and how we can kind of use that understanding to gain a deeper understanding of how to harmonize our overall well-being.
That's a really good question. So there's a book published in the 80s, or I think it was first published in the 80s at any rate, by Richard Gerber, MD. And the name of the book is called Vibrational Medicine. And basically Richard Gerber was working, I think, either as an oncologist or possibly even an endocrinologist. And he noticed that the people who had cancer that he was working with, who were also undergoing alternative treatments like crystal healing and Reiki and all these other things, even Bach flower remedies, homeopathic remedies, so on and so forth, they had a much higher rate of healing and successive remission, and especially long-term remission, than those patients that he saw that did not do anything other than chemo and radiation. So this got him literally, just so inquisitive about this that he started going out and trying to collect data and studies, and it led him down this long wormhole. And that book was absolutely pivotal to me growing up. I think I got my hands on a copy sometime between ages 16 and 18, and I started reading it, and he's an MD, so basically what that tells you is that he went to school to learn how to write papers, and this is no different. It's full of tons of scientific data and scientific study in a very scholastic way, but he presents everything from Einsteinian physics and how every other mode of science, every other branch, I should say, of science, has actually adapted based on the theories of relativity and the whole concept of E equals MC squared, except for modern medicine, which is still looking at things from a very Newtonian angle. And so he starts there and he starts to say, look, you need to take a look at energy. And for example, your physical body, you might be very, very aware of various aspects of your physical body, especially like if you cut yourself, like you look at your skin all the time, or if you have, some sort of blemish, you notice those things. However, most people are actually not aware at all of the caliber of their thoughts or the caliber of their emotions and how much they're allowing thoughts and emotions to be able to impact them. But if I were to ask you to give me a handful of your thoughts, it'd be virtually impossible for you to do that. Same thing with your emotions. Those are forms of subtle energy, though, that we're constantly interfacing with all the time. Also, hand me some of your discipline. You can't do that, but that's something that you are actually interacting with constantly as an individual. If you go to the gym regularly, if you go for a run in the morning, if you, go to church weekly, if you, any of these things, those are all disciplines that people do, and that is what builds their spirituality. So we're already familiar with these forms of subtle energy. It's just that the terminology and the way that it comes across when most hokey practitioners or people who don't have a very firm understanding on these principles start talking about subtle energy, it gets jumbled around and lost, and it's like, okay, yeah, cool, crystals do this and that, whatever. But the answer really is that they do, and every different thing has various energy, and we would refer to the various different types of energy: physical, astral, causal, and spiritual, or sometimes that's referred to as physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual energies, as multidimensional anatomy, because all of those things are stacked one upon the other, like I was talking about with vitality, and they actually comprise what that organism is and how it behaves and how it comes across. Some things, like for instance, I always have this very large piece of moldavite here. This is very astrally potent because it actually comes from the astros. It comes from the stars. This was a part of a meteor, boom, come down, hit the earth, and turn some of the earth minerals, because of the heat and other things, into the moldavite, or into, there's even magnetite and pyrite and things like that come from meteorites. All of those things, because they come from the stars, they have a lot of astral energy to them. And they might also have various other frequencies to them in terms of causal energy. Like, it was part of the plan for this asteroid at some point within the cycle of the cosmos to be able to come and collide with the Earth. And so there's some causal energy in there too. So all of the different precepts of things like crystal healing or subtle energy healings, any form of vibrational medicine, of course, flower remedies, all these things, in Richard Gerber's book, he breaks down how they interact with our human multidimensional anatomy and how they actually begin to impact us from a scientific angle. And he includes a lot of different studies, many of them taken from Canada's McGill University, which has put a lot of time and emphasis into these over the last 30 or 40 years. And being able to bring out some of this information. And again, his book was published back in the 80s. So if we were to actually take all of the modern studies, especially like there's an entire school of medicine and a research facility in China where they will, with oncology, with an ultrasound machine, they'll actually be able to show what a tumor looks like in real time of an individual or of a patient. And then all these doctors are trained in mentalist practices where they chant a particular word or phrase over and over in unison with this certainty that they've been trained to feel and visualize. And you can see in real time, using the ultrasound, how the tumor continually shrinks. And if you don't understand the principles behind the vibrational medicine and the multidimensional anatomy, then it seems like hocus pocus. And it's like, how could that even be happening? Once you understand the principles, though, it's just as scientific as performing surgery. Even perhaps more scientific. It just begins to open medicine up into the realm of looking at Einsteinian mathematics and the concepts of quantum relativity and so on and so forth.
Ashley, thoughts?
Just taking it all in. So he's, I relate it right now. I'm 3 months pregnant. So of course, everything you're saying, we just went to an ultrasound today. So we went through infertility for 3 years. We were told by 3 different doctors that we couldn't have kids.
Wow.
Lo and behold, naturally we got pregnant. so it's just, it's funny because I was talking to Sky last night, and, when you're pregnant, you have this heightened sense of awareness of everything. And you have this natural energy. And then sometimes you have this where you're tired and you're fatigued, and you sleep. So last night I had this burst of energy, and I said, it's so strange because it's like, having some sort of ultra stimulant in your body, but it's this natural feeling, and I said, do you ever think about, where your thoughts come, or, awareness of all this stuff? So it's just funny that you're talking about these things because, initially I'm going, is this just a female thing? Because I journal a lot, and I like to reflect on how I process things when they happen. And then down the road, how I process them looking back and reading what I wrote, and how different experiences shape something that initially I experienced. And then having more experiences on top of that, it makes it more dimensional and more diverse. So I'm always contemplating, and Sky is more, hands-on. And when he works with plants, he's very, practical and methodical in what he does. So it's just interesting to hear you talk about kind of the difference between the awareness and things like that. So.
Yeah, totally. That's cool.
So how does the chain of command work within the various planes in relation to any given cause of disease? Between, say, the astral, the etheric, the physical?
I have to be very careful in the way that I discuss this so the FDA doesn't crack down on me. It is hypothesized. There are theories that would suggest, including the theories posited by Paracelsus as well as Dr. Richard Gerber and others, that there is a certain chain of command that precipitates from the most buoyant form of energy, or the most volatile form of energy, which is spiritual energy. And in that plane, which the Kabbalists would refer to as Atzilut, there is this precipitation of oneness-based energy. And in that plane, there's really no distinction between various forms of what could precipitate as different beings, entities, ideas, concepts. It's all oneness-based. And that's where everything ultimately draws all of its life source from, is from that one original state. It then precipitates down into the causal plane, which is to say, when something knows itself no longer as oneness, but as two different functions of oneness, which we would conceive of that as like in TCM or Oriental medicine as a yin and yang principle. So you have, a very passive feminine principle, then you have a very active dynamic principle known as yin and yang. These two, and in alchemical and Western terminology, that's known as celestial salt and celestial niter. Realistically, if I were to talk about this in ways that most modern people could like wrap their mind around, it's binary coding. It's zeros and ones. A zero turns off a function, one turns on a function. Zero turning off is a passive aspect, one turning on is an active aspect. Everything that we see, including the video that people are watching right now, has all gone through an interface that has compiled various sequences of zeros and ones through short code, long code, and then series of codings in order to bring the reality that they're seeing of this video or the audio that they're listening to reality so that they can actually perceive it and interact with it. And the same is true when you take a look at just existential reality. There is a causal plane of zeros and ones. So there's a greater sense of this, or a macrocosmic sense of this, like what is the purpose of things coming into existence in the first place? What is its origin point? What is it doing in the middle? And what's its end point, which is 0, 1, 0. That realistically is the causal plane. And any action or any thought, anything that we engage in at all, it all has some sort of purpose, some sort of meaning that contributes to the overall coding of the entity that is experiencing that thing. And so this is the first place where we begin to see a differentiation of universal life force energy, in Vedic terminology, prana, in, Chinese philosophy, qi, in Western philosophy, ether. All of these concepts really are the very same thing, and they are just precipitating down and taking various forms based on their active and passive natures. From there, it precipitates down again into the astral nature, which is combinations. We refer to the astral plane as short code and short code combinations. So the astral plane is where you take series of zeros and ones and you combine them together. So and in the Western pantheon, in alchemical terminology, Western alchemical terminology, we have earth, water, air or wind, and fire, which are all of the four elements from which everything is composed. And this, dates back to Pythagoras and, after him, Aristotle and Plato. And so we call these the Aristotelian elements. But realistically, what that looks like is that 0, 0 would be earth, because it's passive. It's the most passive element. And technically, there are two passive elements, earth and water. These are both very feminine. In fact, I like to refer to earth like if you take sand and you drop it, all of it's going to absolutely fall and it's going to stay very stationary. It's enacted upon by, gravity, and it just falls to the earth. This is very, very passive. It doesn't try and resist. It doesn't try and move, etc. However, if we take water and we do that same thing, we're going to notice that some of the water sticks to the hand and it drips down, and some of it is active and it will flow, and then it will create a puddle. And in fact, we rely on that for the movement of all of the waterways, not only of wave systems within the ocean and lakes and so on and so forth that oxygenate things, but also for rivers and streams and creeks, all of the things that give life force to areas away from the ocean. and away from large bodies of water. And we sometimes like to joke as alchemists and say that water is aggressively lazy because it will do anything that it possibly can do in order to be at rest. It will eat away mountains, it will tear through entire valleys and so on and so forth, so that it can ultimately come to a lake or to a pond or so on and so forth. So this would be the active of the passive elements, and this we would call 1, 0. Then we have air, which would be basically the passive of the active elements, 0, 1. And then you have fire, which is always active, very dynamic, very hot, fiery as we know it. This is 1, 1. So you have these 4 basic sequences that, when combined together, like what happens when you add earth and fire together? Well, if you add the right type of earth, say peat, or the right type of tree, like hardwood, and fire together, then it burns really long, burns really hot, and it produces a lot of energy. Now that is in itself an astral archetype. In fact, the 4 elements themselves are the core astral archetypes from which everything else kind of precipitates and is made, including planetary energies and so on and so forth, are all made of various combinations of these elements in various proportions as well. And it's conceived within the alchemical paradigm, especially of the Arabic alchemists, in around the year 600 to about 900 AD, as we know it now. All of these principles were really what coded the universe and what made a differentiation, and also to the Greeks before them, made a differentiation of all matter. Everything was composed to some degree of fire, air, water, and earth, but how much, what the interactions were between those elements, and in what proportions, of course, really determined the difference of a particular material. And then finally, all of that precipitates, well, and there's a layer actually between the astral and the physical, so I'll talk about that. That's called the etheric. And the etheric basically takes the coding system, and if we were to talk about it in modern terminology that people might understand, this is like the UI, okay? This is the user interface, the etheric plane. So you first create your coding, okay? You use common logic and you create your coding out of binary or short code or whatever, and then you test the user interface, does it actually work? And if it works, then everything aligns in such a way that you can begin to see the shape that it's going to take at the very end. Like you test the program to see if the programming actually works. And so this is what the etheric does, is it basically structures all of the energy inside of a material to be able to say, here's what our coding is from the astral plane, here's what our purpose is from the causal plane, here's where we derive all of our energy from the spiritual plane, and here's where this is supposed to form cells, tissues, organs, etc. And then finally, there's the physical plane, which is composed of all of those cells, tissues, organs, etc., that are being put and arranged in the same way that the UI basically said, or the testing UI, is able to put it in, so that you actually have a functional program or a functional video game at length that you can interact with, move, and be tangible with. And that's kind of the precipitation of energy: physical, causal, astral. Between the astral and the physical, it exists the etheric, or what Paracelsus called the archeus, and then finally into the physical plane. And so all energy is conceived to precipitate in that particular way.
Fascinating. Now, with like the chakra system, I've heard there's 7 chakras, and I've heard there's 9 chakras. Where do you fall? What's your opinion on that?
So here's an important thing to understand. Within the science of Veda, not Ayurveda, just all of the Vedas, the Vedic sciences, there are there are multitudinous chakras, too many to actually be able to count, because a chakra exists inside of every single joint, every single gland, every single aspect of your human multidimensional anatomy, and it draws to and connects to, through the nadis, to multiple different energetic points that are constantly refining that. So you have, chakras in the center of your hand, you have chakras in the center of your feet, of the soles of your feet. You have chakras, the primary 7 that exist within the human anatomy, starting with Muladhara and ending with the crown, Anahata. No, sorry, Anahata is the heart. I'm forgetting crown off the top of my head. But yes, all of these different chakras are basically within the system. And then modern New Age philosophy has also started to look at the soul star chakra, which exists above the head, about, if you reach your arm up above your head, about that same length, there's this thing that they would refer to as the soul star chakra. And then inside of the earth, there is also another chakra that is basically what they would refer to as the earth star chakra. And then you have more chakras that extend infinitely above you and infinitely below you, connecting you to all points of spiritual and terrestrial origins.
Now, when you kind of explained it like that, like in between all the joints and everything, is this kind of what practices like acupuncture are tapping into?
They're actually tapping into the etheric body. And so acupuncture, Tai Chi, all of these things, they're working with taking energy from their astral point of origin and directing it from that astral point of origin through, in Chinese philosophy, they call these the meridians. In Vedic philosophy, they call them the nadis. And in Western philosophy, we'd call it the fascial network. But they're drawing forth the astral potency from a particular organ system or chakra system through the body, through these networks, and being able to channel it in order to open up all of the points. Same thing with acupuncture. It's to stimulate various points within a particular meridian system or nadi system in order to open up that flow of energy and to restore health to the entire meridian. Because the astral source of energy, like for instance in the Chinese cosmology, you have a spleen. The spleen is center and the heart of, so to speak, the spleen meridian. You have gallbladder. Gallbladder is the center of, the astral center of the gallbladder meridian. Same with liver meridian, so on and so forth. You have 12 major organic meridians. I guess triple burner isn't really an organ per se, but we could call that the endocrine system. But you have these like systems of the body that correspond to organs in most Oriental philosophy, and they just stack them straight up vertically in most forms of the Vedic system, looking at them as the chakras. In the Western system, we have the same thing. We feel that the planets are made manifest inside of the organs, like Saturn inside of the spleen, for instance. And so Saturn's astral energy sits inside of the spleen, and it has an entire cycle of energy that moves throughout the body that you're able to work with. And the ancient Egyptians also had a very similar concept of that, although they referred to them kind of as a canal, or what we would refer to, I guess, today as a channel of energy that originated in various points. But almost every ancient culture has some concept of this. And that's what I was talking about that interface. In Richard Gerber's book, he calls it the physio-etheric interface, which is it's halfway between the astral and the physical. And that's kind of the network where we can draw astral power into the physical body.
Wow. And so when you're creating like an alchemical spageric, you're basically trying to figure out what, say if somebody has a certain issue related to a certain part of their system that is off, you would want to get a specific type of plant that corresponded to harnessing the specific astral or etheric energies in order to kind of deliver that into the system and cure or heal that ailment. Is that kind of a way of explaining it?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one thing that you can do. For instance, if a person has an astral imbalance, you could draw upon the astral energy of a particular plant that corresponds to the very astral body that is out of balance inside of the individual, and then be able to use extraction methods that harness that astral power and keep isolating it to its purest form while getting rid of the rest of the excess or the dross that does not belong to that, and then begin to channel that power into the physical body, but it's extracted from the herb itself. And that happens in a physical way, but it also happens through the physio-etheric interface as well, harnessing that astral power in through the herb. But it really depends very largely on what the source of origin is for the imbalance that is caused that creates the symptoms within the cosmology of Spageria in the first place. So if somebody has a spiritual disease, like ein spirituale. There are 5 causes of disease in Spageria, and so if somebody has ein spirituale, which is cause of disease due to spirits, that could look like things that originate in the microbiome, actually, but what the disease or the symptom is within the Western cosmology and terminology today is actually going to be based in some sort of neurotransmitter or hormone imbalance. And so it's trying to find out what is actually happening to create that. Is it electromagnetic stress? Is it radiation? Is it an actual disembodied entity? Is it, like I was just working on a client the other day, and we found that this client has eczema due to numerous different neurotransmitter and hormone imbalances, but the neurotransmitters were primarily histamine as well as serotonin that were out of balance. And when we found out what the root cause of that was, is due to a lack of shikimic enzymes from the shikimate pathway produced in the microbiome. And we have to be able to remediate that microbiome to be able to produce those enzymes so that that person can actually digest and assimilate the aromatic amino acids of tryptophan, phenylalanine, I'm trying to think of the other one. Tyrosine, as well as vitamin B9 and all other folates. And so that's what those particular microbes that are part of the shikimate pathway in the human microbiome are responsible for. And if we don't have those, you could be eating foods that are rich in every single one of those amino acids or vitamins, and your body's unable to break them down and assimilate them in a way because they don't have the enzymes and coenzymes necessary. But what causes the disease or the symptom itself is not the lack of shikimic acids, but rather the lack of, and not even the lack of amino acids or folate. It's going to be the lack of bioreplication of, and biosynthesization, I guess I should refer to it as, of various hormones and or neurotransmitters. So.
Wow. And so back to the Kabbalah for a second. So where the Kabbalah, is the origins, is that from a text called the Zohar, or was there actually origins within the Egyptian culture? Because I've heard 2 different things on that. I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Historically speaking, it's hard for us to be able to tell if the Hebrew adaptation of Kabbalah actually came to them through Egyptian or pre-Egyptian sources, such as Mesopotamian, Sumerian, so on and so forth, or whether it was something that was indigenous to Hebrew culture all along. Based on the best anthropological and archaeological and historical studies that I have, it's still very, very debatable. So I can't answer that. But what I can say is that there are a couple of different schools of thought on that. Like you said, one is that they derived the information from the Egyptians, and while both in trade with the Egyptians at a various point during the temples of Solomon and so on and so forth, as well as later during periods of enslavement inside of Egypt, there could have been many different cross-cultural swaps that were made of ideas, of philosophies, of religion. And the same is true with the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians, just in general, Babylonians being a key part of Mesopotamia, is that the ideas could have already originated from a culture outside of their own and become incorporated into Hebrew culture at a certain point. I don't even know that I'm enough of a specialist to be able to speak authoritatively on that. All I can tell you is from the research and the extensive reading that I've done, I still feel like it's up in the air. It's 50-50. But what we do know is that the Hebrew culture has largely preserved it and also passed that on to Western culture at the time that Kabbalah with a C, because every different way that you spell Kabbalah actually has a different indication. So when you spell it with a K, K-A-B-B-A-L-A-H, that indicates that it's Jewish Kabbalah. When you spell it with a Q, Q-A-B-A-L-A, that indicates that it's Hermetic Kabbalah. When you spell Kabbalah with a C-A-B-A-L-A, then that typically indicates that that's of a Christian Hermetic perspective. And so all of those things were incorporated into the West originally from the Hebrew tradition. And those were primarily going to come from what we would now refer to as Ashkenazim Jews from Eastern Europe. So part of I forget the name of that small little empire there for a while, in the like modern day Turkey, basically. But they were given a declaration that they needed to either be Christian or Muslim or Jewish, and they chose to be Talmudic Jews, specifically of a Babylonian variety. And they had a lot of Babylonian roots. Babylonian Talmudic Judaism was kind of the religion that they had, and that's where the spread of that information made its way not only into the Moorish lands of southern Spain, but also from the east, like Russia, Ukraine, Poland, all of those areas, Croatia, and moving westward throughout Europe, leading into early Renaissance times.
So interesting. Okay, this is like a totally off related question, but I wanted to ask you this. So what is the benefit psychologically or otherwise of the presence of having alcohol within a spagyric or a medicine? I know initially it's vital for like proper extraction of spagyric medicinal compounds, but once the extraction has taken place, what is the benefit of keeping the alcohol present within the medicine? Is it strictly a method of preservation, or does it act like as a delivery system, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a brilliant question. And the answer is both of those and more. So yes, whenever something's preserved inside of 95% ethanol, it doesn't decay. It perfectly is preserved. There's even specimen that we have, several hundred years old of things that were put into a jar with very pure spirits that are still very much so preserved inside of that jar. So yes, it is a method of preservation. And we've noted that for whatever reason, just like wine, when it gains alcohol, like if you put grape juice into a jar and try and age it, it's going to go rancid and moldy, and it's not going to do very well. You put wine inside of a bottle and you preserve it for several hundred years. Now it becomes a very vintage style wine, and the chemicals inside of the wine actually undergo some form of gentle change over many, many years in order to create new chemical constituencies and therefore different esters and taste profiles than what the wine did when it was originally made. So you hear things like maturing like a fine wine. Spagyrics also tend to do that when they are preserved inside of ethanol. But it also is a very, very potent delivery system that gets directly into the bloodstream and circulates throughout the entire blood. And one of my theories, I have yet to provide any sort of data for this, IDF, clinical studies, anything. Nothing has ever said any of this, really. It's just kind of one of the impressions that I theorize upon at the present moment, is that it also interacts with lymphatic system, with lymphatic fluids, to be able to move deeply through the fascial network and to be able to move through the lymphatic network as well. So yeah, it seems that we do know that it is very penetrable in the blood. So if we take a spagyric that's inside of alcohol and you put it under your tongue, immediately the sublingual penetration is going to put it into the bloodstream. Also, because it's near the head, it's going to break through the blood-brain barrier because of the ethanol and move into the blood and the brain, impacting therefore the nervous system and the endocrine systems. And then it's also going to circulate throughout the blood, making its way to all of the skin, tissues, cells, so on and so forth. And what makes spagyric medicine really unique is that it's iatrochemically bonded to a potassium ion, at least in the herbal kingdom. Is bound to a potassium ion. In the metallic kingdom, usually to the ion from which it comes. So like magnesium-based things, magnesium's a metal. Magnesium-based things go into the bloodstream as well. Calcium-based things, calcium's a metal, that goes into the bloodstream as well. Most of the animal kingdom reduces down either to calcium, silica, or to sodium, especially sodium chloride. And so those would be the metallic intelligences that are passed through, but the potassium is the metallic intelligence of the majority, 95+% of the vegetable kingdom. And when they're iatrochemically bonded, what that means is that scientifically there are potassium ions that are actually chemically bound to the alkaloids, to the volatile oils, to the active constituency of the herbs. So ethanol just becomes the delivery system to put that into the bloodstream. And then from there, that iatrochemical medicine circulates around the body. So if we were to take an herbal tincture or a glycerite, for instance, which is made with glycerin, doing a glycerin extraction of a particular herb, and put that in the body, you typically need to have very large amounts of it. And the bloodstream, the blood temperature, the digestive acids and enzymes inside of the body, they're going to break that medicine apart really quickly. And there's no guarantee that it's actually going to get to where it's actually meant to go in the first place because of that breakdown. But when it's bound iatrochemically to a metallic ion, specifically potassium, calcium, sodium, magnesium, gold, silver, copper, etc., then it circulates through the bloodstream much more efficaciously. And in the case of potassium, that's actually an electrolyte. Same with sodium, is an electrolyte. And so it can be filtered through the kidneys, it can be filtered through the liver, and so on and so forth, and make its way to more of the vital organ sets inside of the body.
All right. So one of my favorite conversations of yours that you've done, I think it was with Joe Roop of Lighting the Void, and is because you guys touch on a few things that are really important to me. So I wanted to get your take on magic, because I'm someone who has a love for, an appreciation for the occult, and I'm always wanting to give people an authentic understanding of occult subject matter in ways that might clear up some of the misconceptions or eliminate misconceptions or assumptions, because there's so much overwhelming data out there. And that's why I love talking to you. And, we live primarily in a Judeo-Christian nation, which I have no issue with. I've benefited tremendously from that, although as someone who's been immersed in this culture since my youth, I have come to recognize certain patterns or sort of like programmed responses and lines of thinking in, an abundance of people that are really just kind of missing the mark on this. And this is an issue that appears to run through not all, but many veins of various organized fundamentalist leaning religious communities out there. But I'm just speaking mostly from my experience personally. There's without a doubt almost an indoctrination type situation that seems to occur and appears to instill and perpetuate fear and judgment around certain subject matters, including that of the occult. Even the word itself is a trigger for some, and I guess it's one of my lofty goals and aspirations to do my best to dissolve the fear and clear up the confusion and reveal the truth in that regard. So with that being said, let's get into it. I have reasons why I think this is the case, but I'm curious, why do you think people are fearful of the occult? And then we can get into what is actual magic really, the positive and negative pole. What's the good stuff versus the ego-based, self-serving, black magic stuff, all that?
Oh, great question. This is actually something I'm really passionate about as well, so I'm very happy that you brought that up.